7:30. We are streaming. Glad for you all to be here. If you've arrived, we're excited to be with you tonight. As you're entering in, if you want to just drop your name and where you're currently located, that would be really great for us so that we can orient ourselves to one another tonight. We're going to continue to give a moment for people to arrive here. Thank you for being with us. Our good friend Jen is our tech host tonight. They will be monitoring the Facebook Live comment section and communicating with us. We can't quite see you tonight, but we are excited to be with you in the ethereal realm or this virtual realm. I'm Kyle Sullivan, and I'm excited to be hosting this with a good friend tonight, Drick Boyd. If you want to introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Drick Boyd, and it's good to be with you.
Lost your volume there, Drick.
Well, you can't hear me? Let's get it here. Hello, everyone. My name's Drick Boyd. Glad to be with you.
Drick. Awesome. We can hear you again. Then it's my technical error. Okay. Can you hear me now, Drick?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Wonderful.
Welcome, everybody. If as you're arriving, you want to drop your name and where you're located in the chat, that would be beautiful for us so that we can connect with you tonight. We have Krista from Chicago. Welcome. Rebecca from West Philly. I'm currently in Rochester, New York. Drick, where are you right now?
I am in Broomall, Pennsylvania, in the western suburbs of Philadelphia.
Can you say the name again? Because I always say it wrong.
Broomall, like
Broomall.
There are a number of shopping malls around here, so I just say Broomall because when I moved here, I was struck by all the malls.
We have Thomas from Alexandria, Virginia, and Jean from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Cynthia from Indiana. Welcome. We're excited to be with you tonight. We're creeping at 7:33 here, so we're going to dive right in with some tech highlights, give a little overview of where we're going. So tonight's session is called Healing White Body Supremacy. This is a part of the Racism is Real dialogue series with Roots of Justice. I'm Kyle Sullivan, and I'm here with a good friend and partner in crime for the evening, Drick Boyd.
Hello, everyone.
And tonight we're streaming on Facebook Live. Drick and I are cozy together on Zoom here. We have our friend Jen who is moderating the chat and the comment section on Facebook Live. That's going to be the best way to communicate with us this evening. We'd love for you to stay engaged. We are both prior pastors in a previous life, and so the engagement, the amens, the whatever else you'd like to show, questions, comments, excitements, concerns, frustrations, any of it is welcome tonight. And you can throw it into the Facebook comment section. The invitation tonight is to grab a pencil and pen, or a pen and a piece of paper, or you can have your phone with you just as a means of tracking where you are tonight, some of the things that you're feeling and experiencing in your whole embodied system. and to track some of the learnings that you'd like to take away or to ask further questions about as you move from this space. If you registered for this event, the recording will be sent to each of you through email, and it'll be accessible tomorrow, and it will also be posted to the Roots of Justice YouTube page. For accessibility things, you should be able to find all the accessibility features right through your Facebook page, and Jen in the comment section will be glad to help you out. So those are our tech highlights, accessibility, questions, the chat feature through the comment section, and then recordings coming your way tomorrow. Here's our agenda for the night. As an embodied practitioner, I am oriented towards the recognition that all of us carry trauma in our systems. And so one of the things that I prefer to do is to give us a roadmap of where we're going so that we can orient our bodies, our minds, our emotions, and our spirits towards safety, towards this real presence together. And so tonight, we just went through a welcome and some tech highlights. Right now, we're going through the agenda. In just a moment, we'll talk about the objectives. We'll take some time in practice tonight. There's going to be 2 practices, and these practices are engaging with our bodies and engaging with our body mind, recognizing that we are not just bodies, we're not just minds, we're not just spirits, we're not we're not separate beings. We are integrated creatures, and each system impacts the other. And so we're going to spend some time with our bodies tonight. Drick and I are going to give some introductions to ourselves and how we come to this work. And we're going to talk about white body supremacy. We're going to come to a place where we'll talk about some modalities of healing, and we'll wrap things up with one more practice and a Q&A. And throughout, Q&A is not just reserved till the end. Jen will let us know any questions that arise, and we'll send them our way, and we will gladly address them throughout our time together tonight. So from right from the outset, our objectives tonight are to have a more comprehensive understanding of how racism impacts and harms white folks' ability to be fully human. That racism is not just an other problem, but a racism is essentially and fundamentally a white person problem. The second is to have practical tools to be with and heal the ways racism impacts our internal and embodied system. And this is for the purpose of partnering with the oppressed of all facets of life to dismantle all forms of supremacy in the collective towards collective liberation and collective flourishing. So in this moment, I'd love for you to find that pen and paper or whatever note-taking device is accessible to you in this moment. Just locate that. And take a moment just to recognize where you are, maybe orient yourself to the space that you are currently in and any distractions or even gifts of what is around you in this moment. Taking in the colors of your room, the sense through all your sense organs, the smell, the taste, what you're hearing, not just my voice, but what is going on in the room. And taking notice of what you are experiencing in this moment. That oftentimes we talk about experience as just feeling, and this gets diverted to emotion. And in the Western world, we don't trust our emotions. But right now we're talking about a full embodied experience. What are you experiencing in this moment? Is it discomfort? Is it ease? Anger, frustration, annoyance, joy, compassion, gentleness? And just write it down, just jot it down without any judgment or coercion. Stream of consciousness, what comes to mind? What are you experiencing in this moment? The topic of racism itself, and even words like white supremacy or white body supremacy, these elicit visceral and embodied responses. And the invitation in this moment is just to notice, just to become aware of this connection of our minds to our bodies, recognizing that these feelings, these experiences are a part of our existence in the world. John Kabat-Zinn talks about mindfulness as being present, aware, and curious. And so if we are unable to bring our attentional systems into focus on our own bodies, our own experiences in the world, even our own discomfort, it's unlikely that we're going to be able to be with the discomfort of dealing with the embodied experience of racism and white supremacy. If we're unable to be and cultivate this attention and awareness of ourselves, it's unlikely that we will be able to bring a collective cultivation of a white culture that embodies an anti-racist philosophy. Becoming an anti-racist is practice. Recognizing that we're not going to be good at first, and that we can exercise these muscles to actually dismantle this idea of showing up perfectly. And so I'd like to invite you to find a comfortable seat, and a comfortable seat, one of deep attention. And deep attention, in my experience, and it's going to be different for all of our experiences, but is finding an upright seated posture. The upright seated posture is often with our ears stacked over our shoulders, stacked over our hips. If you're standing, you would include stacking your hips, your knees, and your ankles. But if you're seated, it's finding a comfortable seat where you are anchored to the earth. And that can be anchored to the earth through your chair or through the floor or whatever seat you're in. And finding, whether it's with the bottoms of your feet or with the other parts, if you're sitting on your knees or on your butt, whatever is most comfortable, finding a rootedness, a connection to the earth. And the invitation in this moment is to either close your eyes if that feels safe and available to you, or to find a gentle gaze just down in front of you, just past your nose. And to connect with your breathing. Your breath is one of these bodily functions that is autonomous. Your breath keeps you alive, whether you like it or not. It does this thing automatically. But it's also this function of our existence that we can interfere with, we can influence, we can even control. And so tapping into this resource of the inhale and the exhale, and just noticing how breathing feels in your embodied experience. Drawing an inhale through your nose or through your mouth, and allowing it to expand through your ribs, the lower ribs where the diaphragm attaches, and allowing that breath to flow out. This little attentional focus allows us to come into deeper attention to ourselves and our full experience. Staying with your breath, recognizing what that does for you. If it becomes too intense, knowing that at any point you can back off, trusting yourself, your own intuition, your own body, that it's going to communicate when too much is too much. But also discerning for yourself when discomfort can actually be leaned into. Much of the work of tonight comes from the work of res momentum. And the idea tonight is to try to reframe this conversation of racism and white supremacy into an embodied approach. We've tried to teach and think better about race. We've tried to do DEI trainings and consultations and debates. But these cognitive modalities have primarily been ineffective. Primarily because we are not primarily cognitive functioning humans. We function from our embodied experience. What if white supremacy doesn't live in our thinking brain? What if it lives and breathes and finds its existence in and through our bodies? So maybe we need to look at the embodied experience and the embodied trauma of white supremacy. Our bodies hold a form of knowledge that is very different from our cognitive brains. These are felt senses of constriction and expansion, pain and ease, energy and numbness, maybe tapping in right now to what you're sensing in your own body. And often this knowledge is wordless. It is pre-verbal. And so even right now, maybe finding the dissonance of trying to function from a different perspective, not from the mind, but from the attentional system of the entire body, receiving information instead of controlling the information that comes through. In this wordlessness, our systems are reaching out and trying to discern what is safe and what is dangerous. The body is where we live. It is the vehicle of our being. It's where we hope and fear. It's where we respond and react. The body cares most about safety and survival. And when something happens too much, too fast, or too soon, and we don't get enough safety or care or regard, it can overwhelm our body and it can create trauma. And much of this is sensed through what is called the vagus nerve, the wandering nerve or the soul nerve. It has tendrils throughout the main systems of our body, and it directly connects to our lizard brain. The lizard brain, if you can imagine in your current experience right now, as you're attuned to your breath and to your body, the image of a lizard and how a lizard functions. A lizard is primarily concerned with safety and survival. And our vagus nerve, our nervous system that connects us all to the nervous systems of other people and to the earth, has 4 responses: fight, flight, freeze, and rest and connect. So noticing in your own system in this moment, staying attuned to your breath and to your body, which of those 4 states are you currently in? If I were to be honest about my experience and being on this call, there's a little bit more of a flight and a freeze response, and the regulation of my breath is trying to bring me back into deep rest and connection. And when our systems experience these responses of fight, flight, and freeze primarily, it releases stress hormones, predominantly cortisol. And small amounts of stress are great for us. They help us learn, they help us get out of danger, they help us do a number of things in our lives. But when stress persists over long periods of time and in large amounts, our lizard brain embeds reflexive trauma responses, these wordless stories of danger, and these live in our body. And so contrary to what the main story about trauma and safety are, trauma is not primarily an emotional response. Trauma is an embodied response. It's a spontaneous protective mechanism used by our body to stop or thwart further and future danger and damage. Trauma is not a flaw, it's not a weakness. It's a highly evolved and effective tool of our safety. Trauma is not an event. Trauma is the body's response to an event or a series of events that we perceive as potentially dangerous. And it gets stuck in our body, and it gets stuck there and stays there until it's addressed. Our rational brain can't stop it from happening, but we can use our rational mind, our rational experience, to be with and soothe and manage and move out these traumatic responses from our bodies. Trauma can cause us to react to present events which might seem extremely inappropriate, overly charged, full of negative energy, or otherwise out of proportion. I think we can imagine some of those experiences of our own lives where people just react instead of respond. We freak out suddenly, or we make a small problem like a catastrophe. And these patterns can be repeated and passed on over generations, and they do. They're inevitably passed on through our genetics, our culture, and our family structures, and they become standard responses in individuals, families, communities, and cultures. And so maybe in this moment, in your attention to your breath and to your body, calling up maybe some of those patterns that have been handed on to you. All of these things describe trauma in general, but it also describes white supremacy specifically and particularly. And so we've been trying as a collective to deal with and eradicate white supremacy like it's an attitude or a cognition, a belief system, or even just a way of seeing the world, as though it's a part of our thinking brain. But this is a myth. It's misguided. Because white body supremacy lives in our blood and our bones. And so the beautiful thing about our blood and our bones, our human body, is that it also has the mechanisms to metabolize this embedded trauma. That trauma can be healed. And healing often involves discomfort. But discomfort is also a key component to refusing to heal too. And the goal here, by being with our bodies, that we can grow capacity to be with our discomfort, to be with the difficult situations and experiences of our past and our present, so that we can create a more connective, flourishing, liberated future. And so the vagus nerve, this one that is contributing to our fight, flight, freeze, and rest and connect, it's directly regulated by our stress. And so our stress can then be directly influenced by our breathing, by our drawing our awareness to our breath, drawing our awareness to our bodies. And in the moments of overwhelm, learning how we can be with that effectively through our own care and compassion and attention. So as you continuously invite presence to your breath and body, at any moment tonight where there's discomfort, the invitation is to come back to it. Reassuring your system that you're safe, that you can be with the discomfort. And through our breath and our practice of embodied awareness, our pain, collective pain and individual pain, can mend us and build us more capacity for growth. And this clean pain that we can cultivate, as Resma Menakem calls it, it elicits courage, compassion, curiosity, and connection. And so taking 2 more deep breaths, inhaling and exhaling. The invitation is to come back to the space that you're in, opening your eyes, bringing awareness back into your extremities. Going to look around the room that you're in, reorient yourself to this space. When we turn our head left and right, up and down and around, we're cueing our system to safety. When we are in threat, our eyes expand and our focus draws in on the target of threat. But when we can look around, we cue our whole system, our lizard brain, to safety. And we can vocalize as well. one of the beautiful things about the vagus nerve is that it runs down past our vocal cords. And as we hum or sing, we can bring real comfort and ease to this wandering nerve. And it can bring us into states of rest and connection. And so maybe humming a vowel sound like a or an o or an ah, bringing yourself back into the space, maybe shaking hands or feet or bringing yourself back to this comfort place. If you watch a dog after a stressful situation, it shakes because it's releasing its stress. And then you can come back to a comfortable seat. And as you come back to that comfortable seat, just jotting down any thoughts, random notes that come from that experience, stream of consciousness and without judgment. And then I'm turning things over to Drick.
Okay, thank you, Kyle. So I wanted to just say a bit about who I am and what brings me here. I am a professor emeritus from Eastern University, where I taught for 22 years. And the last 12 years of my time, I taught a number of courses, one of which was entitled Race and Ethnic Relations. And we explored the nature of racism in our society and in our culture. Are you having trouble seeing me, Kyle? Trying to.
I cannot see you in this moment.
Huh. Okay. I don't know what's going on here.
No problem. Take your time.
Stop video. Okay. No one can see me. I can't see me either. So we're all together. Don't know what that. No, I can see my square. Oh, there I am.
Oh, there you are.
There's at least
You
my
came
picture.
back.
My
Yeah,
picture.
if you want to turn, you should be able to turn your camera on now, and we should be able to see you.
Well, that's why I can't find where my camera is. Guess I'm just going to have to. Oh, there it is. Okay, here I am.
There you are.
Yeah, I'm all right. I'm not just a voice. So, as I started to say, I taught at Eastern for 22 years, and in the last 12 years, I was part of the urban studies program where I taught a course on race and ethnicity. It was called Race and Ethnic Relations. And we dealt with a lot of the issues around racism that we're going to talk about tonight. But my journey through racism and learning what anti-racism really begins much earlier. I refer to myself as a recovering racist because by which I mean I'm a product of a family, a community, and a national culture that led me as a young person to think that my experience as a middle-class heterosexual male was basically the same as other people, regardless of their race or their gender or sexual orientation or the class. And it was only when I left that environment, when I left my home to go to college, that I began to see how wrong my assumptions were. I came of age in the 60s and the early 70s. And so I had witnessed the civil rights movement from afar, basically through what was reported in the media. But when I moved to North Carolina to go to college, it was there that I was confronted with the fact that racism was alive and well in our culture. And later I came to see it was alive and well where I grew up. I just didn't see it. I saw statues honoring soldiers of the Confederacy. I saw clear evidence of segregation in the city where I was living. There was a town not far from where I lived, Smithfield, North Carolina, where when you drove into that town, you met a huge billboard that said the KKK of Smithfield welcomes you. And overt racism and covert racism was very evident at all levels of my life. And then after I graduated college, I went to Boston, Massachusetts to work with youth in a neighborhood that consisted in fairly equal numbers of African Americans, Puerto Ricans, and poor Irish Catholics. And I witnessed each of these groups experienced discrimination in different ways, and I saw how it began to shape the way they saw themselves and how they viewed their future. And even so, I was very naive about racism at this point in my life, thinking that if we just ran programs that brought Black kids and Puerto Rican kids and white kids together, that somehow we could solve racism. But as we're going to discuss later tonight, I was yet to learn that racism was not just about how people treat one another, but it was also about the systems in our society that perpetuate racist processes and practices through their policies, through their work, and through their structures. And so much of my life has involved not only learning about racism and how it works, but unlearning the things that I had grown up with and that I continued to encounter in my life. And so in calling myself a recovering racist, I see myself as sort of like a recovering addict who never says, I'm cured, I'm over this, but is always saying I'm in process, I'm always recovering. The only other thing I'll say by way of introduction, and then I'll turn it back to Kyle, is I think you ought to be very wary when two white guys like Kyle and I get up and talk about racism as if we know something about it. And we do, and much of it we have learned by trial and error. But I want to encourage you to challenge us and ask the tough questions. And because all of us are being impacted by racism, often in ways that we aren't aware of until someone calls it to our attention. And so I'm very glad to be here, and I hope that we can engage in some back and forth in terms of how the racism that is all around us and in us, and as Kyle is so spoke so well about how it's embodied in us, that how we can work together to work for a better world and work for a better life for ourselves. So I'll turn it back to you, Kyle, so you can introduce yourself more freely.
Thank you, Drick. I always appreciate being with you in that perspective. Always be wary of us. So if you have questions or concerns or pushback, please drop it in the comment section, and we'd love to be in dialogue with you tonight. I'm Kyle Sullivan. I am currently, I'm from and reside on traditional Haudenosaunee land in Rochester, New York. The gratitude to the people of this land and this place, not just in word, but in partnership. And my desires is always in partnership with people of the Six Nations. And I come from from English settler colonialists, but I also come from a lineage of Irish refugees that were fleeing the same trauma of British colonization. And I find that this meeting of two worlds, of oppressor and oppressed in my own lineage, has stirred something in me. And this understanding, both an embodied understanding and a cognitive understanding, that the oppressed perpetuate what has been done to them in the white form, and become oppressor. And this is a strange experience in the white body. And when I situate myself in the historical context of whiteness that I've learned over the years, it becomes clearer and clearer to me that this is an embodied experience. And so my own lived experience, just kind of coming out of the macro contextual of my people, but to come into the micro of my own experience, I am a child of an addicted and incarcerated parent. Parents experience homelessness and childhood poverty, and these experiences in my life left me in neighborhoods in partnership with people who didn't look like me. And so as a white male presenting person in this world, I was exposed to different ways of being that I found to be more kind and generous and gentle and compassionate. And as I looked at the suffering of my own experience and the suffering of those around me, I was drawn through my own exposure to liberation theology and a Christian perspective that there's a better future that we can create together. And so my work has spanned from being in ministry as a youth, emerging adult, and discipleship pastor, to being in higher ed as a ethics and world religions professor and an assistant dean of students in residence life. And now I'm the drive of the last few cycles of elections as an ethics professor drove me into wanting to be in the classroom more and understanding why, when we talk about difficult topics like politics and racism and abortion, why do we have these visceral embodied responses to our deeply held beliefs? And so I started my PhD a few years ago studying moral and spiritual development, these questions about what does it mean to be human and what does it mean to be a good human, and settled into this understanding that this vision that we can have for a more whole and connected and vibrant future together starts by cultivating our inner world. And so I study compassion development, this idea of meeting suffering with love, that love stays loving after it encounters difficulty, discomfort, and pain. And seeing that compassion is a key feature of creating a more just and equitable world. You know, I'm shaped by the likes of Howard Thurman and Paulo Freire, who talk about the simultaneous dismantling of systems of oppression and the building of systems of liberation. And that liberation is for everybody, that truly even the oppressor is oppressed in some way, and that they are not living a full life. And so my drive in this work is that we can be governed together by compassion and courage and gentleness, and we can embody the Christ nature, the Buddha nature, the nature of the love that holds all things together, and yet we don't. And so why? What are the barriers to this life together? And so I come to these main questions about, like, what does it actually mean to be human? And so I'd love for you to answer that question. If you want to open up the comment section or your own note-taking device, like, what for you, what is this overarching question of what is the human? What does it mean to be a human being actually mean for you? What's your initial gut response? Why are you here? What are these larger questions of existence? And then maybe dig a little bit deeper into that question. Like, what is the end goal? Like, what are we, are we here just to make money and to die and hand that money on to our children? Or are there richer, deeper, more meaningful things to this human experience that we have? And so I wanted to sit with that question. What does it mean for you to be human? And then drilling down into this more question, like this deeper question of what does it mean for you to be a human? And so for me, to be a human is to do the human thing well. An acorn finds its full flourishing when it becomes a full grove of oak trees. And so for me, the question is, well, how do I do how do I do the human thing well? And this means integrating all facets of the human expression. See some people in the comments say to love and to be loved. And I don't think that that's soft or, kind of just flippant love. That's real deep connection, care, love that meets suffering. And so for me, it's about bringing together the physical, the emotional, the intellectual, the cultural, the spiritual, the ancestral, thing that we as humans develop in a context. And we have the ability to change and grow and develop over time. And sometimes we have affordances, and sometimes we have advantages, and sometimes we have barriers and disadvantages. And so for me, the question of my own human experience was there were some significant barriers to my own flourishing in the world. And as I began to explore that, recognizing that those barriers weren't just mine, there were others as well. And others suffered in a deeper and different way. And so the questions became like, what have I inherited? What have we inherited as a species or as Americans or as white folk that create barriers for us being fully human? And what have we inherited that creates affordances to being fully human? And these things come across all areas. These come from our physical ability, our emotional ability, our spiritual abilities, our familial, ancestral, individual, cultural, systemic, spiritual things. And so it came to a place of deep introspection that we have to acknowledge where we come from. and that where we come from and the context we are situated in has assets and detriments that show up in our multiple identities. And so the question maybe for you to jot down or to drop in the chat is to say, well, what systems would you need or would we need to experience a flourishing life? For me, as I've studied world philosophies and world religions, a thing that has stood out to me as the common thread is that the only thing constant in life is change, and inherent in that change is an attachment to how life how life is and it can be, and that suffering and change and pain are universal, but they're also necessary and beautiful components of our lives, and that we can learn how to be with our suffering well, that instead of internalizing our suffering and inflicting more suffering into the world, that we can be with our suffering with curiosity and compassion, and we can transmute that pain into beautiful, flourishing life together, so that our suffering doesn't hijack our current and lived experiencing, but we can be with our suffering so that it connects us, that it brings us together. That this discomfort, this suffering leads us into the depths of ourselves, into the richer fabrics of life together. And that my suffering and your suffering are inextricably tied to each other and tied to the suffering of all beings. And so I may not see my own suffering to be at the hands of racism, but that racism has inflicted suffering on me in the form of white supremacy, where my whiteness is missing out, lacking in its full human capacity because of this experience. And for me, from a larger perspective, it's that no one is free until we're all free. That none of us are home until we're all home. That we're not islands isolated in our, vigorous individualism, but that we're connected and need one another. And collectively, that when we reduce suffering in ourselves, when we're able to be with calmly and with real care, so that our pain can transmute, we can reduce the collective suffering as well. And so from there, to situate us in a larger picture of what does it mean to be human? What does it mean for me to be human in this world? What are the barriers that prevent this human flourishing and this more than human flourishing? And how do I meet suffering with kindness and compassion? Kind of situate me in the world. Drick's gonna dive into this question of racism and white body supremacy.
Yeah, one of the things that we want to talk about, and I want to talk about here, is how racism hurts white people. We tend to think appropriately that racism is most injurious to those who are persons of color and who are the objects of our discrimination, our disgust, our dehumanization. But as Kyle has sort of outlined, in fact, racism dehumanizes all of us. It makes us less than fully human in what we understand being human to be. But I want to start with just a definition of what do we mean by racism. In Roots of Justice, we have a very simple equation that we use to describe or define racism, and that is that racism is racial prejudice plus systemic power. Race prejudice plus systemic power equals racism. Now, often many people think of racial prejudice and racism as the same thing. But racial prejudice is a prejudgment we have about another person based on the racial group that we perceive them to be a part of. And when white people often say, well, I'm not racist, what they are really saying is they don't have prejudice against persons of color. They don't have negative thoughts. They don't use racially charged words or support overtly racist actions against other people, all of which is good, all of which is fine. But what they don't understand and often don't see in themselves is that there are things that they don't know that they are doing or saying or conveying that send a very different message to persons of color around them. And this is because they aren't aware of the systems and the culture of which we are part that very naturally makes many of us as white people to simply act toward persons of color in a very derogatory and discriminatory way. So that's why we're not talking about racial prejudice tonight. We're really talking about racism. And the key thing about racism is the second half of that equation, that it has to do with power over another person. When a person is in a position of power, they can use that position to discriminate against, to dehumanize, to make fun of, to manipulate other persons. But there's another level to racism, and that is the systemic power, the systemic racism. Because even when a person does not engage in those overtly racist actions, or is not meaning to do or say things that are harmful and discriminatory toward others, the institutions, the culture, and the systems that they are part of treat whites and BIPOC folks in radically different ways. And this is systemic racism. Now, another word you've heard already us use when we're talking about racism is white supremacy. You know, in the past, especially when I was growing up, when people talked about white supremacy, what came to mind was militant white groups like the Ku Klux Klan. But today, when we talk about white supremacy, we're really referring to the institutions, the policies and practices and societal structures that serve whites far more favorably than they do people of color. And we see this in all areas of life. For instance, in housing, systemic racism, white supremacy, if you will, determines where people can live and where they can live being accepted and being comfortable, and the conditions that they live in. In education, white supremacy determines the quality of the schools that folks go to, that students go to, depending on their race. It determines the kind of social services that are available to people in their neighborhoods. Are they close to community centers? Are they close to hospitals? In healthcare, access to quality healthcare is highly determined by one's race. And during the pandemic, we saw these discrepancies clearly evident, that people of color were not getting access to tests, to vaccines, to the kind of help that they needed. And it was only when others saw this and set up alternative structures to try and serve those in communities of color that they began to get some of the things that they certainly deserved. We also talk about food deserts. Food deserts are very common in communities of color where there are not stores that provide high quality food for people to eat. And on it goes. All areas of life, white supremacy makes its way known. Let me give a concrete example from my own experience. For the last 12 or 13 years, I have been part of an interfaith social justice network called Power here in Philadelphia, which has been advocating and protesting for the Pennsylvania legislature to enact legislation that will ensure that state funds for public education are equitably distributed, regardless of the racial makeup of a school district. And even though we have been able to prove, using the government's own numbers, that predominantly white schools are far better funded by the state than schools with a higher percentage of BIPOC students. And even though we've had a class action suit that went all the way to the highest court in the state, which ruled that in fact the legislature was discriminating on the basis of race as to how they distributed the funds for public education. The legislature is still balking, is still making all sorts of flimsy arguments why they can't change the current funding pattern. Now, I am sure that there are legislators who are opposing what we're calling for and what the court has now said they must do, that these legislators would say, no, I'm not racist. I want the best for all students. But you see, the system that they are part of and that they are overseeing clearly discriminates when it comes to how funds for public education are distributed in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. That's how systemic racism works. It's larger than any one person can do. It's really the cumulative effect of people's decisions and actions within institutions. Now, while we may all agree that white supremacy is built into the systems and that these systems must be challenged, we don't realize how often, or how white supremacy has mentally, emotionally, and spiritually and physically affected people as well. And this is not to in any way minimize white supremacy and its effect on Black and brown and indigenous people and people of Asian descent, but it also impacts whites in profound ways that often we don't realize. What does it mean to be white? Well, let's imagine if we went back, if we were living in the 14th or 15th century in Europe, you know, there would be no such thing as a white person in Europe in those times. If you and I climbed into a time capsule and landed in Europe in the 14th or 15th sentence and got out of the time capsule and said, hey guys, I'm white just like you, they would look at us and say, what the heck are you talking about? We don't know what you're talking about with white. We're French, we're Italian, we're British, we're German. You see, these Europeans only became white when it became important for them to distinguish themselves from the people in Africa that they were seeking to enslave. Being white only became important when they landed on what the indigenous people of this land called Turtle Island and took the land that these people lived on and drove those people and killed those people for their own well-being. And you know, there was a whole new branch of science that developed in this period whose whole purpose was to prove that white people, that is, people of European descent, were smarter, more capable, more fully human than those folks in Africa that they were enslaving and the indigenous people they encountered when they landed on Turtle Island. And that science justified their treatment of people in an inhuman way, in a dehumanizing way. Another consequence in the United States, at least, on this focus on being white and white being the higher standard, white being the best there could be, was that when immigrants chose to come to this culture, come to these shores, they soon realized they needed to give up their culture, they needed to give up their language, they needed to give up their ethnic heritage and embrace whiteness if they were to be fully accepted. There's a provocative book entitled How the Irish Became White, which describes how this process worked for immigrants from Ireland. You know, similar books could be written about people coming from Germany, from Italy, from Poland, from France, and so on. But those who came from a culture and a background where people had darker skin or had Asian features, those folks were out of luck because they could never be white. And therefore, they were automatically regarded as lesser than, as second-class citizens. But this process of becoming white and embracing what we call white supremacy, that white was the standard, this had a cost also for white people, both for BIPOC people, but also for white folks. And as we've already learned, an author, a psychologist by the name of Resmaa Menakem, wrote a book called My Grandmother's Hands. And there was a sociologist by the name of Joy DeGroy who wrote a book called The Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And both of these authors, both of these scholars documented how the experience of capture, enslavement, Jim Crow, lynching, and the broad-based discrimination that African Americans and Hispanic Americans and Native Americans throughout history have experienced, that these experiences traumatized them and caused great pain in their bodies, as we've heard. And as Menachem called this white body supremacy trauma, because it literally got lodged in person's bodies. And this process affected person's health and their longevity. But more than that, this trauma, this embodied trauma, was passed on from generation to generation through a process called epigenesis. The impact of trauma affects the genes, such that the impact on that trauma is transferred genetically to the next generation. So a person living today can feel the impact of racism in their body, not only because what they have experienced themselves, but also perhaps because of the effects of trauma experienced by their ancestors decades or if not centuries ago. And while that is true for persons of color, how it is also true for white people. First of all, Menachem points out that there were many people who emigrated from Europe who came to escape violence and exclusion and poverty that they experienced back home. The Puritans, for instance, came to the area that we now call New England. And they came here because they were being persecuted for their beliefs. And so they came to this country to try and start a new life. It's said that many of the people who were shipped to Jamestown after the initial settlement in Jamestown, Virginia, were people who were the English government simply swept off the streets, who were homeless, or they emptied out the prisons and they put them on boats and they said, you're going away. We're getting rid of you. You're going to this other place. And these folks landed. They were not farmers. They did not choose to come here. And they experienced tremendous trauma, and they died in huge numbers. So we brought trauma. Those of us who have of European descent brought trauma with us, or our ancestors did when they came. And that trauma has been handed down from generation to generation, just like our colleagues who are friends, who are people of color. But then when these European immigrants came to this country, they dealt with their trauma, or sought to deal with their trauma, by acting out their anger and their rage and their woundedness by inflicting suffering on others. And so when we read about the brutality of white people against enslaved Africans and their massive efforts at murder and lynching against Black people, and the genocidal actions that were taken against indigenous peoples when they encountered the Europeans, when they landed on Turtle Island, what we are seeing, I believe, is the effects of the trauma on white people that they're inflicting on others. There's a German sociologist named Bernard Giesen who coined the term perpetrator trauma. And Giesen studied the impact of the Holocaust on the German people. And he found that while the Holocaust caused irreparable harm on the Jewish people and others who were tortured in the camps, it also brought a loss of humanity on the part of those who participated in causing that suffering, and even those who were blind beneficiaries of Nazi brutality. And that trauma still exists today. If our ancestors participated in the enslavement and the brutality against others, if our ancestors participated in eradicating whole tribes and moving them off their sacred lands, that what they have done, that trauma that they expect, perpetrator trauma, has been passed on to us. And just like BIPOC folks, this effect of white body supremacy trauma gets passed on from generation to generation. And so when white parents are shouting and swearing at school board meetings these days, or politicians are ranting about critical race theory and race being taught in grade schools, which of course it's not, or when people are banning books by preeminent authors of color like Toni Morrison, I believe what we are seeing is this historical trauma being made evident in self-destructive and dehumanizing ways on white people themselves. And more often than not, this trauma often causes white people to support policies that are really against their own interest. A medical doctor by the name of Jonathan Metzl wrote a book called Dying of Whiteness. And Metzl points out that when MAGA politicians oppose the Affordable Care Act, or advocate for looser gun laws, or defund public education, or call for taking money out of Social Security or reducing Medicaid, and they base these acts, these positions on immigrants coming over the border, or on people of color asking for too much, they actually are persuading white people, especially those who with limited incomes, to support actions and policies that actually deprive them of vital resources and benefits. And this practice is so pervasive that Metzl says, as a result, the average lifespan of white people in America is actually decreasing, is actually going down. All of this is to say that much of how many white people are acting today are the effects of racist acts and beliefs of their ancestors that have been handed down through their genes. It always has amazed me how quickly white people react when the topic of racism comes up. They walk away. They accuse me of trying to make them feel guilty or ashamed. They get defensive. They get angry. And very often what's going on is the effects of white supremacist trauma is kicking up. It's churning in their bodies, and they can't control themselves. They react in ways that undermine their own well-being. And these are just some of the ways that racism hurts white people. And this is not to any way diminish the impact of racism on people, brown people, Black people, Asian people, indigenous people, BIPOC people in general. But it is to say that we are hurting ourselves as white people when we engage or allow these kind of actions to take part. Back to you, Kyle.
Thank you, Drick. Yeah, I want to emphasize that in bringing to light the research about how racism and white supremacy impacts the world and well-being of white folk, that is not to compare the suffering. That comparative suffering actually does nothing in solving the problem, but it is to situate the reality that racism and white supremacy in all of its forms is not just an other problem. It is a white problem deeply impacting our lives. And so as a white person, as two white folk, the situation, I'm sharing my notes, here we go. Thank you, Jen. The context that we want to situate ourselves in is that white folk are not free from the harm of what we've done to others. And that it lives in our bodies, it lives in our genetics, and we pass these ways of being literally through our genetic expression to future generations. And until we recognize that racism is a white person problem, that white supremacy is a white person problem, this trauma, this embodied trauma, will continue to be passed on and perpetuate suffering, not just for ourselves, but for everybody that we come into contact with. Trauma doesn't go away on its own. It has to be faced, it has to be lived in, it has to be experienced, processed, metabolized. And so while the suffering and harm that has been done to people of color, indigenous folk, people of Asian descent is far and beyond the harm that is done to white folk, we are not free from that harm. And so when we talk about white body supremacy, we're talking about the ways that white supremacy is embedded in our system. And so here's a clear definition. White body supremacy is the elevation of the white body over and against all other bodies. Whiteness is and has been the supreme standard. When we talk about diversity, when we talk about inclusion, what are we really including and diversifying? We're diversifying and including into the white experience, the dominant culture. And so we need to recognize that the white body has become the supreme standard. And then we can work from that truth, that reality, to dismantle the whiteness as the supreme standard. And so this white supremacy is not just a cognitive belief. It's not just something I think about that shapes my worldview. It's something that is literally in the way that my lizard brain reacts to the world in fight, flight, freeze, rest, and connect. And these ways inhibit our full well-being, our full ability to flourish in the world as white folk. And so I want to say white supremacy is primarily an embodied experience. And threat to that supremacy results in trauma responses that are reinforced culturally and systemically. And so as white folk, the invitation is to enter into our own suffering, because we can only truly know our own experience. But we have to be able to have the skills of awareness and consciousness and stillness and presence to actually be able to be with our own suffering, to recognize that the suffering that we experience can allow us to empathize with the suffering of others. And that in that empathy, we can find ways to partner with each other to find new realities to alleviate that suffering. And that comes at the individual and at the collective and systemic. We as white folk could avoid a whole lot of stress by not turning and addressing these things, but we are not unaffected. We have the embedded advantage, privilege of not having to look at it. That doesn't mean it doesn't affect us. And when we turn towards it, when we embrace and love our own suffering, the ways that we have harmed ourselves in the perpetuation of oppression, we're better humans with more capacity for compassion and love and courage. And we can engage in difficult conversations and excavate from ourselves the ways that white supremacy orients us to the world, so that we can create better, more whole, more beautiful futures. And so how do we do this? How do we actually be with and excavate this? I want to say that the primary way to do this is one word. That one word is connection. And connection happens at 4 levels: connection with our whole self, connection with others, connection with the beyond human world, and connection with the great mystery. And so this is about building capacity for connection, authentic connection, not veiled or hidden or shame-based guilt connection, but real authentic connection that's living in truth. And so the first is to connect with ourselves, that we, in connecting with ourselves, can become self-aware of the ways that we are affected by collective and epigenetic cultural traumas. We can become more critical thinkers. We can become more compassionate. We can cultivate these higher qualities of the human experience, like love and courage and justice. We can recognize our own bodies, our emotions, and our reactions, knowing that we don't want we don't want to live life controlled by reactivity, but we want to be agents of our own life, participating fully with the choices that are in front of us. And we can be with this skillfully. So that means connecting with ourselves physically, knowing our physical bodies, knowing our physical capacities, being with them in the beautiful diversity of how our bodies show up in the world. Being with our emotions, knowing that these things are not meant to be put into a corner and shamed, especially as a male-bodied person, a white male-bodied person. The only emotions that I'm typically allowed to feel is anger. Everything else is out of line. So what does it mean to look at the full spectrum of my emotions and evolve my emotional capacity by learning new ways of communicating how I'm feeling, knowing that feeling happens in our bodies, not just in our minds, and actually feeling those emotions instead of intellectualizing them. That we can be with ourselves in our intellectual and belief pursuits, the ways that we think about ethics and justice in the world, what our values are. This is also being with ourselves in the cultures that we create in our own homes, the values that we have with relationships. This is also our own spiritual well-being, the ways that we connect with the depths of the light within ourselves. And this is also connecting with our ancestors, knowing that we have great resource with us, recognizing that whether or not I participated in the harms of my ancestors, I carry their DNA in my bones, which means I carry the effect of that harm with me and have the potential to perpetuate it in the rest of the life and the rest of my life. Working with our nervous system, connecting with our breathing so that we can reduce our stress levels, so that we can actually come into calm and stay there, that we can uncloud our minds. We can recognize our deeply held beliefs and be with them. Knowing that shame, guilt, and denial are not enjoyable experiences, that it's easier to move away, but that we can grow capacity for discomfort and intensity in our lives so that we can be more engaged and more agentic. And so bringing awareness to all aspects of our lives so that we can influence the ways that we interpret the sensations of our experience to become responsive in the world. Go ahead, Drick.
Second way we can do this is to connect with others who share our concern and our commitment to anti-racism. For me, that took the form of about 10, 12 years ago of looking at where I was spending my volunteer time. And I decided I wanted to only be part of organizations that were led by people of color. Now, that's not, depending on where you live and your circumstances, that may or may not be possible, but being with people who share your concern about racism and are working to overcome that in their own communities, in their own places. It allows you to interact with people whose life experience is vastly different than ones that your own, and learn to see issues from their perspective. I'm going to give a little advertisement here. One of the best ways to do it is come to a Roots of Justice racism analysis training, where we, for over 3 days, we come together and we talk intensely about some of the things, and even more than we've shared tonight, in terms of how racism works in our lives, in our world, and how we sometimes are complicit in the very things we say we don't want to happen, and how we can begin to change. And we do that in settings where we can share with one another our own experiences and our own struggles. And so I'm just going to put a plug in that one of the best ways is to go to an anti-racism training, and I think Roots of Justice is one of the best that is out there. If you are in a community where you may not have ability to have contact with persons of color because of whatever situation, there are groups like SURJ, Stand Up for Racial Justice, which was a group that was started by white people who were concerned about working on racism. And SURJ has done some great things, SURJ. You can find them online. They are a great group. This is not something we do alone. This is something we have to do with others and in community. One, because you just get more done when they get more people, but also we need to be able to interact and get feedback. Some of the most profound things in my own life is when people of color who I've been in relationship with have called me to account for something I've said or done. In many cases, not even knowing that what I was doing was as harmful as it was. And having that trust to be able to hear from one another and begin to make changes. So connecting with other people, doing this, not just by yourself, but finding others that you can deliberately and conscientiously begin to do the kind of work that we need to do to understand the nature of trauma in our lives and how it's affecting our bodies and how it's affecting our perspectives, and then to make the changes we need to make. Back to you, Kyle.
Yeah, and in laying ourselves at the feet of those who experience the direct harm of racism, it's not to expect people of color to do the emotional labor or intellectual labor of understanding our whiteness. Right? Oftentimes we can continue to cause harm by expecting that type of labor from others, but it's also to come into community with other white folk to discuss what it means to be white in the world, and that we can recreate a culture that we handed over in order to take on the identity of whiteness. And we can take on a new culture, a culture that is embracing an anti-oppressive and anti-racism perspective. and philosophy, and that's embodied, that we can do these embodied practices together. Yeah, that we have skin in the game. It's not just, we're not doing this work for others. We're doing this work for ourselves and for collective liberation as well. Yeah, thanks, Jim. Yep, to justify our privilege. So as we connect with others, it's coming into community as well with other white folk to discuss these things, and to not expect people of color to do this work. This work for white people. The third is to connect with the more than human world. This is an Indigenous American term that recognizes that the human is not the center of the universe, that the human is part of an ecosystem and has responsibility to the more than human, to the birds, to the four-leggeds, the mammals, the flying ones, the ones with fins, also to the plants and to the stones. For me, white supremacy is rooted in human supremacy. By removing ourselves from nature, by removing ourselves from the ecosystem in an intellectual and philosophical way, we have dismembered ourselves. And so we are not separate from nature. We are nature. We are part of it. And so from a Christian perspective, which many of us may or may not participate in, Genesis 1-3 clearly articulates that the human is meant to be the steward and caretaker of the earth. For me, to be anti-racist is also to be anti-oppression in all of its forms. So that means to root out the human supremacy in the ways that we exploit the earth. And from an Indigenous perspective, human are the little siblings of creation, that we have learned everything and we owe everything to the creatures and plants and stones because they have taught us how to survive. And so there's a huge indebtedness that we have to be in relationship with the earth. And so we can go and be and honor the earth in so many different ways by appreciating what we have, recognizing the food on the table comes from the earth and has been stewarded over thousands of years of soil cultivation, connecting ourselves to a larger ecosystem, recognizing the birds and the flowers in your own yard, laying in the grass, appreciating the beauty of creation itself. Connecting with the more than human world allows us to recognize our smallness, and in itself removes the propensity for supremacy in both the small and in large ways.
And then finally, we can connect with the great mystery. We may call that great mystery God. We may call it the transcendent. We may call it the higher power. We may call it the universe. But it is recognizing that part of being human goes beyond who we are to those powers in our lives and in our world that give us strength and give us a sense of direction. A spiritual practice that informs and strengthens us to do the hard work, to deal with the discomfort, to deal with the pushback that we get from folks. Because believe me, when we get serious about anti-racism, our white friends and colleagues often will push back in ways that are quite surprising to us. I believe, for me, and I'm speaking here now as a Christian, that anti-racism is a spiritual practice in of itself, that it includes how I read the Bible, how I meditate, how I pray, how I live out my faith, that it is something that is as important as any other aspect of my faith. And so what I find is that as I try to integrate my commitment to anti-racism and overcoming white supremacy, not only in myself, but in the world at large, that I gain strength as I go before God and root myself in the spiritual practice that strengthens me for the struggles that come in combating racism. And so that these are the 4 practical steps: connecting with yourself, connecting with others, going beyond the human world to see ourselves in a broader perspective, and connecting with the transcendent, with the great mystery.
And so as we come into deeper connection, one of the ways that we can do this is through our own intentional awareness practices. And so in this moment, I would love for you to set down whatever note-taking device or phone you might have in your space, any type of distraction that might be here with you, and to ground yourself in your own body, to notice what is arising in you in this moment and where it's arising. Where do you feel? Where do you experience this in your own body? How does this land? Does it cause discomfort, excitement, desire to deny or run away? Recognizing that in 90 minutes, we're only scratching the surface of what this means for white folks to dig at the ways white body supremacy shapes our lives and our necessary commitment to being and rooting out white supremacy in ourselves and in our families and in our communities. And just notice the outline of your skin and the sensations of the air around it. Experience the more firm pressure of the chair or bed or couch that's underneath you, or even the floor or ground beneath your feet. One of the necessary cultivations in our life to pursue anti-racism and anti-oppression work is hope. Some of these problems can be overwhelming in their size. And white folk are afforded the ability in that overwhelm to turn away from it. And so if we can cultivate in ourselves radical hope, we can have the staying power to do the difficult work of excavating this from our lives and moving it from the individual to the collective to the systemic. And so can you sense hope in your body? If you can, where do you experience it? And what is the quality of that experience? How do you experience it? Maybe it's release. Maybe it's expansion. Maybe it's a tightness. Maybe it feels like eagerness or anticipation. Are there images that arise in the presence of hope for you? Dreams, chance to heal, to be free, to live a bigger, more rich, more meaningful, more flourishing life? And committing that sense of hope, that feeling in your body, the sensation in your body to memory. That hope in any moment is available to us. And in the same moment, do you experience fear in your body? If so, where? How does it show up for you? Is it isolated and acute to one spot, or does it radiate in pain? Is it an emptiness, a dead spot, tightness? What worries or images accompany that fear? you afraid of life being different, unpredictable, of turning towards your pain, towards the pain of others? Do you feel the wordless fear, the storying that is embodied? Or maybe there's excitement that comes with change. What pictures appear in your mind as you experience that fear? And be with it, committing that same feeling to memory, and knowing that you can always turn back to your breath, your own awareness of this sensation, to recognize reactivity instead of response, to calmly stay with presence in the discomfort, to be an active and agentic participant in the world. And if your body feels both hope and fear, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Because as we enter into the world, and as the world continues to shift, we need both of these in order to move us towards a real and sustainable future where change and flourishing occur, characterized by our devotion to an anti-racist and anti-oppression framework and positionality in the world. And as you recognize both fear and hope, inviting your presence back to your breath. Feeling the gift that it is to be alive, the exchange of carbon dioxide for oxygen that you have no say in. The miracle of your body churns over for you. And allow that to fill you with gratitude, courage to walk into the world committed to a more beautiful future together. And as you take one more deep inhale and exhale, returning back to this space, orienting yourself to the room that you're in, bringing your body into the awareness of safety. And we recognize that it's 8:58 and we'd love to stay and participate in some conversation, so we will stay here, but you are free to go at your own leisure. We're glad that you stayed with us and joined us in this conversation, and would love to continue this conversation. If you'd like to collaborate with any of us individually, here are our emails. We'd love to have a conversation. We're also available through the Roots of Justice Network and our active participants and trainers with that collective. But if you have any questions, concerns, comments that you'd like for us to address, please drop it in the comments, and Drick and I will dialogue with you. Thanks so much, Jen, for moderating the comment section for us and dropping this in, keeping us in the awareness of the Facebook Live. Appreciate you. As Jen is dropping those comments to us, you're welcome. Thank you for your kindness and your presence tonight. Here are some additional resources if you'd like to dive in. Much of this work is thanks to the deep commitment of Resma Menakem and his commitment to the embodied approach to anti-racism Drick Boyd also has a couple of books that I highly recommend. I'll leave these up. Thank you all for being with us. Any last words for you, Drick?
No, just to say thank you, Jen and Kyle. Enjoyed this time together. I wish everybody could have just been on listening in as we were talking over the last couple of months about this evening, because I think we had a lot of great interaction, and I think it just reinforced what I said earlier about having connections with other people. And this is not something we do by ourselves, but we do together. I'm glad all these folks came, and I hope they can continue to work together with each other or with others who are like-minded.
Wonderful. We'll linger for just a couple of more minutes if you'd like to dialogue, or you have any questions or concerns or things that would be beneficial to the collective. All right. We must have done a great job. No questions. Appreciate all your participation tonight. It was good to be with you all. or we wore them out. You're right. Thank you, Drick. Thank you, Jen. We'll stop the stream now and look forward to future collaboration.